Okay, I'm going to start, everybody. My name is Pat Kambesis, and I am with Cave Research Foundation, and I also am a faculty member at Western Kentucky University, and I also am a very long time cave explorer. And originally, I said my talk was going to be about cave exploration in Kentucky, but that's like a pretty big topic because Kentucky easily has like 5,000 caves. It may have even more than that. And there's activity going on all over the state. But I picked Mammoth Cave because there's some really interesting activity going on there as well. So I thought I would just focus on that area, although I could answer other questions that anybody might have. So basically, I'm going to talk about explorations at Mammoth Cave and why is it not going? Hold on just a second. There we go. So Mammoth Cave really technically should be called the Flint Ridge Mammoth Cave system, because the way that cave naming works out is if you connect two cave systems, then the name of the new system becomes the name of the longest cave that you connected with. And the reason why connections are important is because, well, that's how Mammoth Cave and how any cave system in the world gets bigger. Is yes, people explore and map of them, but when they are connected to other adjacent cave systems, then they really, really get big. And that's kind of what happens at Mammoth Cave. So here's the layout in general of Mammoth Cave right now. And this only shows Mammoth Cave. What it doesn't show is the 450 some other small caves that are inside the national park. There are also as many, if not more, outside of the national park. And if you look in the middle of the diagram, you'll see like one of the green lines. And those are just county lines, I think. And that just shows that Mammoth Cave goes outside of the national park out into, into places that are not the national park. So there's a lot of things, and probably some of you have been on a tour at Mammoth Cave, and so you know that it's not just cave passage. There's lots of other really cool stuff in the cave, but the more that we find and the more that we explore, the more of these kinds of things that we find as well. So in that far left side, there is some rock art made by Native Americans, ancient Native Americans. There's some cave pearls below it. There's a signature in the middle of the screen there, and that's actually Floyd Collins' signature. And if you know anything about caving in Kentucky, you'll know that Floyd Collins, who is, old-time explorer of the Mammoth Cave system, became trapped when he was exploring and trying to find new pieces of the system. And unfortunately, no one was able to get him out. So, he's immortalized that way. Then, of course, there's all sorts of cool critters in the cave. I'm showing you crickets and salamanders. And the bottom right really shows that these are artifacts, archaeologic artifacts. So Mammoth Cave, in general, has a lot of really important stuff in it. But it's also representative of all the other caves in the area, too, because they all have this stuff in it. So it's not like Mammoth Cave has cornered the market on awesome stuff. And of course, just some of the passages. Some of these are off the commercial route, which you can see on the right-hand side. There's some fence there, and then people are looking over the fence down into a big blue pool. And there's actually cave passage underwater there. And then, of course, in the middle, that's the Carmichael entrance area. And there is a path that goes down the middle. But I always thought that is the coolest shaped passage ever. And the reason why it's shaped like that, like this big oval, is because at one time that used to be completely filled with water. And then, of course, in the left-hand side is somewhat bigger passage, canyon type passage, which is also characteristic of the system and all the caves around here. So when I talk about Mammoth Cave, I also talk about, all of its related caves. And pretty much there's a lot of caves in Kentucky that share a lot of these characteristics. So how do we know how long a cave is? It's kind of a question. Well, we know because we measure it. And these are some of the tools that we use to measure cave passages. And so on the left-hand side are various devices. Some of them are laser rangefinders. Those are the ones on the bottom that we use. The things above them are actually just Sinto compasses, which up until a few years ago, that's what we did a lot of mapping with, like hundreds of miles. There's also books that we keep where we record the data and we actually draw a rendition of the map as we go. And then, of course, in the middle, you can't do anything in a cave without light. So that's an important piece of equipment. And then on the right-hand side, people, what they're doing is they're calibrating their instruments so that we can get as accurate as we can on the surveys that we do. So just to give you a real quick rundown of how do we survey any cave? And as you can see, you do it with a caving team, with a team of people. 3 is about ideal. And you have somebody on one station so that your instrument reader can cite it. And you have a person that's collecting data. And on the left-hand side is the rangefinder, and you can see that it's pointing right at a little orange flag. And so pretty much that's how not only Mammoth Cave, but all caves these days are surveyed like this. Mammoth Cave has, I don't know how many survey stations it has, but it has well over 4,500 little survey books of trips that people have done to map the cave. And then here is, just to give you an idea of how would you survey in a cave. And basically, those are survey stations, and it shows how our line just kind of bounces between the cave walls, so we can not only measure them, but also we also make a map as we're going. And this person is being the sketcher, and you can see the data is on one side. This is the sketch map that they made. And from that map is what we make, our manuscript maps from. And I think I have one somewhere where I'll show you. So if you're going to explore a cave, you have to map it, especially if it's a very complicated cave. And so this is a pretty early map. I think it's like in the 1950s, 1954, of Floyd Collins Crystal Cave. And this was before it was connected to Mammoth Cave. And I thought that they did a pretty good job of showing the 3-dimensional nature of this cave. And this is something that when you take good notes and you collect good data, these are the kinds of maps that you make. And you might say, well, why do we care? What difference does it make what kind of map that we make? Well, because that's how you explore caves. That's how you know how to connect them. So, but before I go into what people are doing now, I would be remiss if I didn't give credit to the original explorers and people who did a lot of exploration before the modern exploration. And one of those would have to be to the ancient Native Americans who were exploring that cave 5,000 years ago. And they basically saw about 19 miles of cave within the Mammoth Cave system that we know today. And they did not have fancy lights. They didn't have fancy caving equipment. They just went caving, and for their light source, they used cane torches. You can see up there in the top right, that's cane torches that they've left in the cave. And those things, I don't know exactly how long they'll burn, but let's just say that they'll burn for an hour. I'm probably underestimating. So they would take a number of those, depending on how long they think they needed to be underground. On the bottom left, that's a climbing pole. And this is what they were using to get to parts of the cave that they couldn't reach normally. They brought in a tree trunk and climbed it. And then they left marks in the cave too. This is an example of some of the rock art that's in Mammoth Cave that the Native Americans have left all over the place. And so the most activity, I think that was when Native Americans were going into the cave to collect minerals, okay? But before they could do that, somebody had to be brave enough to go into this giant, dark, black hole with a cane torch and wearing like little woven slippers to actually find these places. And so I think the Native Americans were the most amazing explorers because they saw 19 miles of cave just by like torchlight. And they explored quite a bit of cave. They may have even had a way of documenting it in some way. And of course, over the years, they would have passed down the information about route finding, eventually. So probably they had more of an oral tradition than to actually write things down. So the yellow part of this map shows Mammoth Cave as we know it today, and the orange parts show the parts that the Native Americans explored. So they saw quite a bit of cave. They may not have used the same entrances that we did, because some of them, we're not exactly sure how they got there, but entrances form all the time. New entrances, just geologically form all the time. So they could have very well come in different ways than what we know. So, let me move this out of the way. Move this back. So what I meant to show here is, let me see if I can fix this. Sorry about this. Okay. So what I meant to show here is that cave exploration, even after the Native Americans quit doing it, because they did it for about 2,000 years and then they stopped. And I don't really know why, but they did. But as people started settling in the area, you can't avoid seeing and knowing that there's cave everywhere, because there's sinkholes and cave entrances all over the place. And so caves were also tourist attractions at that time as well. And so they hired people to be tour guides, and Stephen Bishop was one of the people that they hired to be a tour guide. And that should be, he started exploring Mammoth Cave in 1839, not 1939. And this is the map that you see right here is a map that he drew from his explorations. And he saw a tremendous amount of cave. He was a heck of a cave explorer and visited areas that people didn't dare cross before because, well, they just weren't brave enough, or maybe, I don't know, ballsy enough to do it. But he made a first formal map of Mammoth Cave. And this is the parts of the cave that after he spent years exploring it, this is what he knew. So he knew the historic part of Mammoth Cave. He knew a little bit of Salt Cave, but all this stuff in yellow, nobody really knew about that yet in 1845. So people were at that time not knowingly exploring the longest cave in the world. So as exploration continued, as commercial cave development kind of progressed in the area, more and more entrances were found. And in about the 40s, cave exploration kind of in the modern sense starting to become a thing in the area. And cave explorers were going in and exploring and mapping different parts of the cave. But it wasn't legal at that time to do that. So they were doing these covert trips because they had this exciting going, very big cave. And of course, there's nothing that was going to keep them out of that. And they continued to do that, up until they got caught. In which case, that's why they sort of formed a more formal organization that the Park Service was more comfortable working with and allowed them to continue to explore the cave. And why is this not progressing? Okay, so by about 1962, there was a bunch of different sections of the cave that were known. Salts was known, you can see here on the screen. Salts was known, Colossal, Bed Quilt. These were all separate pieces of the cave. Unknown, Crystal Cave, Donkey Cave, or Floyd's Cave. These were all pieces that were just sort of isolated pieces of cave. And then, of course, Mammoth Cave was here. These are all in Flint Ridge. So between the 1950s and early 60s, all of these pieces got connected. And now you had two big cave systems. You had the Flint Ridge system, which was like 85 miles of cave right here. And then you had Mammoth Cave system, which I think was maybe 35 miles. And of course, all this is unknown. And so in 1962, they started connecting all the Flint Ridge caves. And about the late 60s and the early 70s, the people who were making these maps realized and keep in mind, none of this yellow stuff was known, that these caves had the potential to connect, which is kind of totally unprecedented at that time. So in 1972, after about 10 years of, pretty hard work trying to find some way to connect these, because this is in a ridge, Mammoth Cave is in a ridge, Flint Ridge is in a ridge, and in between is a deep valley. And they had to find a way under the valley, and they found it by surveying it. You can't just go randomly explore. Connections are not made randomly. Big connections like this are made by surveying the cave, and then by superimposing your survey on a topographic map so you know where you are on the surface. And that allowed them ultimately to find the route through this very low water passage, and allowed them, so they came in on this side, and it allowed them to come in and eventually connect with Mammoth Cave, with the Mammoth Cave system ridge. And so at that time it was called the Flint Ridge Mammoth Cave system, because Flint Ridge was longer than Mammoth Cave. But I think the reason we call it Mammoth Cave now is because Flint Ridge Mammoth Cave system is a mouthful to say. And these are the team. This is the team that made the connection, but their success was contingent on a lot of other teams before them who went and found routes and who made connections. And so this was cave exploration, at least on this scale, is a huge team effort. So in 1983, here's another, this was a part of the cave system that was yellow that I just showed in the previous map. And this is called Roppel Cave. And it was a cave that was explored separately by a different group from Mammoth. And because based on their survey and based on survey by the other group, they both realized that they could potentially connect. So in 1984, they did a joint connection trip and had groups from each side come in and survey the connection, and basically added another 50 miles to the Mammoth Cave system, making it even longer. And so here we have Mammoth Cave right now, okay? But notice there's other caves here as well. The Flint Ridge Mammoth Cave system, that's what's in the middle, but there are other caves like satellite caves around them. So there's more passages that are not shown on this map for various reasons. There's a big cave system right next to Mammoth Cave called Fisher Ridge Cave System, and it's about 130 miles long and basically extends all the way here. So this is also Fisher Ridge. There's Crump Spring Cave, which is a 10-mile cave system. There's Vinegar Ridge Cave, another 10-mile cave system. And they all have the potential to connect to Fisher Ridge to make it 150 miles long. But so far, the connections have been elusive, like they have not been able to find them so far. The caves even appear to overlap, but at different elevations. And so people are actively looking to, and this would be the Fisher Ridge Project cavers are looking to connect these so that they can increase the length of the Fisher Ridge Cave system. Now notice here that it comes pretty close to Mammoth Cave, but that connection is even though it looks like it ought to be a piece of cake, it's not. Because this is in a ridge, this is in a ridge, this is in a ridge, but right here, this goes into a valley. And so finding the route in here, so far, nobody's been able to find it. And as a matter of fact, this whole section here that I'm pointing to, Fisher Ridge Cave actually extends out toward this area, but for some reason, passages are not yet, the caves are not cooperating in connection. Maybe they connect, maybe they don't. They're pretty darn close. And if they connected, that would make Mammoth Cave even longer. And then there's another cave system down here called Wick Thistle Cave, and it's about 35 miles of cave. And it too is unconnected to the Mammoth Cave system. And so exploration is actively going on here and actively going on this area, and also in all the numerous small caves that are all over inside the national park and outside the national park. They're not all going to necessarily connect, but these guys all have the potential to possibly make a big connection. So I'm going to just give you an example, and I have some, parts of my slideshow that show you what exploration is like in the Mammoth Cave area, and probably similarly in other places all over Kentucky. Here is once again, this is Wig Thistle, by the way, and Mammoth Cave is off here somewhere. And there's a river in Wig Thistle called Red River. And there's also a river well, there's several rivers in Mammoth Cave. But in the 70s, one of the Mammoth Cave geologists injected a bunch of dye, in other words, dye tracing dye, into the river to try to figure out where the water goes. And it showed up in this part of the cave. So we know that this 35-mile edge of the cave is connected to Mammoth Cave by water. So the challenge is, how do we find a physical connection? Because it doesn't count unless people can pass through it. It doesn't count as being connected. And so this is what Wig Thistle, it's the Wig Thistle Martin Ridge jackpot system, because at one time there were 3 different caves, one here, and one here, that were all connected. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, they all were connected by the cave explorers, which is why we have a 35-mile long cave system. So here is one of the entrances to the Wig Thistle cave system. A lot of the entrances at Mammoth Cave, of which there's like 29, they all look like this. There's caves all over Kentucky that look like this. Just because you have a small entrance doesn't mean that you have a small cave. So this is what the entrance part of Wig Thistle looks like. As you can see, it actively takes water. And so exploring it, you have to be really careful of the weather, because if it's really, really dry and then it rains, it's not that big a deal. The water might come up a little bit. But if it's been raining and wet all along and it rains, then this entire passage can fill with water. And that's not where you want to be when that happens. But these people all look really happy because notice they're wearing wetsuits. This is because the water is about 57 degrees and there's places where they have to lay in it. And so wearing a wetsuit keeps you warm and allows you to continue working in the cave. Otherwise, if you got completely soaked, between being completely soaked and the breeze that continually flows through the cave passages, you get cold really quick. Eventually, you do get up out of the crawlways into some nice canyon passage. That might not look too nice to you because people are kind of muddy, but it was a lot nicer than what they were just in. And so the little red dot, if you look, there's a map here, and I try to show with the little red dot where these pictures are from, just to kind of give you an idea. Whoop. Once again, now notice this person is carrying a rope, and they also have kind of a big backpack, and their plan is to camp, because getting to their area of exploration takes a couple hours to get there. If it's taking you more than 5 hours to get to your objective, that's when people decide to cave camp. And I promise you, cave camping is not at all as cool as it sounds, because you have to bring everything in and then you have to bring it out. Sometimes the water gets deep again. This girl is named Gilly Eller, and she is a pretty top-notch cave explorer, and she came and caved with us at Mammoth Cave, or at least at Wig Thistle one year, which was nice. So all that nasty, crawly, muddy stuff leads to things like this. And this is what captures people, and this is why they do that nasty stuff, because this is the potential of the things that they hope to find. So you can see on the little red dot, this is where this passage is, on the little red dot. And this is just in the same vicinity. As you can see, we have some really big, tall canyon passages, and all floored with sediment. It's all floored with mud. And we can get some places where this looks like, if you've ever been on the commercial tour at Mammoth Cave into the historic entrance, right there at the junction when you're right into the big part of the cave, this is the same kind of feature. Eventually, over time, this will collapse and will open up to the surface, but not like for probably thousands of years. So we're never going to see that. We'll see it from the inside. And here's another example of more collapses in cave passages. So this is what segments caves. Sometimes you can't get through these collapses. And so even though you know that those caves were one at one time, unless you can get through that collapse, it doesn't count as a connection. So sometimes people dig through these things, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they dig for a really long time. Here's a little red dot again. And this is the area where they connected the Wigpissel system. They're making connections to the Martin Ridge part of the cave system, which is up here. This was explored from a separate entrance than this. This, I think, has a couple of entrances, but it's a very flood-prone cave. And so this part of the cave is not as flood-prone. So you're not going to get flooded out and drowned in that part. But you will get a little bit of claustrophobia going through some of the small passages. They all eventually open up too, so it's not all grim looking. Just showing another map of the cave. Now, when you go into the Martin Ridge part of the cave, you need rope to get into it. So now you don't have to crawl on your belly through water, but you know that drop, the guy on the right, it's 100 feet below him. So you know it's pretty significant cave exploration and skill-wise to do this part of the cave. And there are shorter drops which we have hand lines on because occasionally, if the water is up, it's hard to climb this when there's a waterfall in here, and sometimes there is. And so we have places in the cave that we have rigged, and we all have specialized gear and training to explore this part of the cave. This is not uncommon in other parts of Kentucky also, where you need a little bit of technical work to actually do to get to different parts of the cave to explore. And this is another technical section where they had to rig a rope so that people can cross this pit. I don't know how deep it is because I don't think anyone has been down it because they were too busy exploring this way. Sometimes there's avenues that you could see that, you know, it's like you want to go there, but you have other things that you have to do. So all these guys were on a camp trip. Notice they have more rope. And so they have, usually when you're exploring a cave, especially a big, complicated cave system, you don't go in there randomly. You go in there with some specific objectives, and you go and you survey those areas because you may be looking for connections. You may be looking for potential breakouts. You're always looking for something. And once you find it, you can't just run down it. You have to survey it. You could run down it, but there's a lot of peer pressure against just running down passage without documenting it. And so that's a really important part of cave exploration. If you don't document it, it doesn't matter how much you see. If you don't know, you know, what it looks like, where it goes, where it is with respect to the surface, then your exploration, the value of it is like decreased. So in the red is Wigpissel Martin Ridge jackpot system. And as you can see, it's really not that far from Mammoth Cave system. I think from here to here is a kilometer, not very far at all. This part of Mammoth Cave, this is an upper canyon and it ends on both sides. So it's not like you could just run over here and connect. I think the Red River section is here, and Mammoth Cave has like, you know, 2 rivers that flow through it and come out here on the Green River. And so between Martin Ridge and the Green River, the water drains there, but we haven't found the cave that drains the water. And so, you know, there's many different things to look for in these cave systems. Now, another place where people have been more recently exploring, because the national park has been a little bit more comfortable with people actually scuba diving in the cave. They're not scuba diving, they're cave diving. And so, and there's a big difference between the two. But on some of these spring entrances, there are ways into the cave that are filled with water that our normal exploration we can't do because we are not cave divers. But these guys are cave divers, and they are on the Mammoth Cave side. They're in Rappel part of Mammoth Cave, looking at, you know, a potential area that goes underwater that they're pretty sure there's more cave passage there. And they did explore it and did map it, and there is cave passage there. This is not that cave passage. This is known passage in Mammoth Cave, and this is part of the water in that section of the cave. And you need little boats so that you don't have to swim the whole way. And if you go down this nice black passage, it eventually leads to the river again. And in the river, when the water's nice and clear, you can see that there's passages that take off. And so that's what our cave divers are looking at. This is how you get to some of these passages. And we've already done some reconnaissance and know that underwater there are routes, and they probably ultimately go to the Green River. It's just that no one has done them yet. Cave diving is a very technical activity and requires a lot of equipment and training. It's not something that if you're certified as an open water scuba diver, that this is something that you can do. It requires a lot of equipment, and it requires a lot of experience to do it safely. And these two guys are some of the top cave divers in the US. And so that's probably why the Park Service feels a little bit more comfortable letting them go in and do this. So this is kind of an interesting rendition of Mammoth Cave system. And it's not necessarily a map of the cave, but what it is sections of the cave as they were explored. You can see that one axis is actually time. And these are all kind of proportional to the size of the cave. And so cave exploration, starting in the 1780s. And as the cave exploration continued, whenever it takes a dive down to this blue area is when there was a connection made. So here in the 20s through the 40s, we knew about colossal, unknown, and crystal, but it wasn't until the 60s that they were connected. Mammoth Cave was, known for a long time, as was the Flint Ridge Caves, and here in 1972, thereabouts is where they're connected. Proctor Cave is another part of the Mammoth Cave system that was connected in like the late 70s and early 80s, and more sections. That's what we're seeing, is more and more sections join this big section. Here's another entrance that was in the 2000s that was connected. And this is where Wig Thistle sits. We're hoping that someday we can put a little branch right here and plug in to the Mammoth Cave system and give it another 35 miles. Now, there has actually been a very recent connection made to the Mammoth Cave system. It was a small cave. It's only about a half a mile long, but it adds a new entrance to the cave system, and it opens up an area that was very difficult to get to in the past. So sometimes, even if you don't add miles and miles, maybe you add a route that makes the remote parts of the cave more accessible. So I show this here because this shows that Mammoth Cave is the longest cave in the world right now, but they actually have some competition. You're like, how could they possibly have competition? Well, there's two underwater caves in the Yucatan, and this chart is a little bit out of date because both of those caves, if they were to be connected, and they're really close to each other, whether they'll connect or not is hard to say because connections are not easy to make. But if they were to become connected, they would become longer than the Mammoth Cave system by about 20 miles. So we have some competition. We have to go and find our connection to Wig Thistle and find our other connections. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll be able to add 130 miles, but who knows? And this, by the way, is what the caves in Mexico that could rival Mammoth Cave look like. And so this whole area, this whole section here is all underwater caves. So these are all being explored by cave divers. And here's a big major cave system called Oshbelha. And here's another major cave system called Sakatun. And right around in here somewhere, they come really close, but they don't connect. Now, will they? They're two different drainage systems, so it's hard to say if they'll connect or not. But I guarantee you that people are out there looking for a connection. And so here is some of my friends who were at a cave camp, and they were just having a little fun after they spent the day exploring and mapping in Wig Thistle Cave and looking for a connection to Mammoth Cave, which they haven't found yet. So cave exploration can be fun. It's usually fun when you're done because then you can take off your muddy clothes. You can go to, let me unshare my screen. Basically, you go home but it doesn't end there, because what you do is now you've collected all this data. So you take it home or wherever. Sometimes you're just doing it on site. You enter all of the data that you collected into a computer program, and it makes a line plot. And that plot is the basis of any kind of map that you make. And it also is kind of like, it shows you where did my cave go? Like, where am I with respect to the surface? Because it's always tied to the surface. And what do we need to do next? You know, where can we find the next bunch of cave? What can we do next? So that kind of concludes my talk about cave exploration in Mammoth Cave. And as I said, there's exploration going on all over Kentucky. Maybe not with, you know, the longest cave systems in the world, but still, nevertheless, there are people out there, dedicated people out there, exploring and mapping caves all over the place. So if anybody has any questions, I am happy to answer any questions. No one has a question. I explained everything so well that no one needs to ask any questions. Either that or I made cave exploration look too scary. I don't know. Is that it?
I think so. We don't have any questions online on Facebook.
Is that kind of what you had in mind in terms of my talk?